Right, we'll take you back to Economist Sifiso Skenjana as we look at the impact of the US elections, especially the impact here in South Africa. Sifiso, thanks for joining us once again. We were talking about how all eyes are on the US presidential elections and that we should be paying close attention as a country on the outcome of those results. Let's talk about the important factors here, especially considering the trade relations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that South Africa is a signatory to the AGOA, which is the Africa Growth Opportunities Act, and that specifically, determines the way in which we trade with some of the countries, including the U.S. We also know that President Trump had a particular emphasis on what we call economic nationalism, which is really around pushing out other economies and trying to make sure that economic activity is centered around the localization of the American economy, and therefore when you now have a more liberal and a more call it other economy enabling approach from Biden, for example, we'll start to see a lot more interest in terms of the bilateral agreement being revisited, particularly from a trade point of view. And so I think that's one of the things that we're going to see. The other one is certainly going to be on investor flows in terms of emerging currencies as well as developed markets. When Biden comes onto into presidency, I suspect the market is going to be risk on for emerging markets again, and that's probably going to start to see a strengthening in the South African rand, and that again will be positive for particularly our imports. And so it's certainly going to be an interesting one to watch. We already saw early yesterday that the rand started strengthening a little bit with the anticipation that Biden might come in as the new president in the U.S. So it's certainly, something to watch, particularly on our trade relations.
And how much of his own interest could President Donald Trump be looking at under the AGOA Act, especially as we consider what happened when he took office in terms of General Motors being dominant here in South Africa? I mean, that was a gap left in the motoring industry.
No, absolutely, and we understand, of course, that car manufacturing in South Africa is our largest, actually, export-led, subsector from an international export point of view. And also, when you look then also in terms of how some of the things that they were bringing to the market around changing the tax regime for particularly car exports, etc. And when you also look at the way in which that particular manufacturing sector continues to be an important contributor from an employment point of view as well as from a growth point of view in a localized South African context, when then we see a Biden administration, we certainly, I think, may find more opportunity again for us to continue being, a trading partner in a more material way into other economies, not just in Europe, but also strengthening our position in the US. And so from a South African point of view, particularly looking at automotive, it's going to be quite interesting. What's also going to be quite interesting is how that ties into the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement, given the work that NAMSA is doing to try accelerate our intra-continental trade, also from a vehicle sales point of view. And so there's certainly opportunities from an AFTA point of view for vehicle sales from South Africa, but I think a Biden administration, I think, will also change the way in which at least the U.S. is interacting with South Africa, given the extent of and the value from a vehicle trade. I think it was about 160 billion that was coming just from vehicle sales exports in South Africa. And so you understand just the sheer volume of that manufacturing subsector.
And how have we benefited from the AGOA Act? I mean, we know that the U.S. is one of South Africa's biggest trading partners, and that act, of course, has been hugely beneficial.
Yeah, well, there are a number of, sectors in which we've had opportunities and other sectors that have been sources of big challenges. Chicken, for example, industries has been decimated in South Africa on the back of the act. The sugar industry has been decimated on the back of that. But there are other industries that have, seen some benefit coming out of that. And so it always is a bit of a give and take. We also saw how the challenges that are, in the copyright amendment bill in terms of the deprivation of intellectual property rights could also impact our position on the Africa Growth Opportunities Act. And so there are a number of spaces right now that are, potential avenues of growth from an AGOA point of view, but we've also seen a lot of subsectors in South Africa take quite a beating because of some of the challenges from dumping, etc., that we saw. And so it has been, I think, a tale of mixed stories for South Africa, that on one hand there certainly have been material AGOA benefits, but there are some sectors that have taken an absolute beating.
Now, as the world battles to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, we also have on the one end the relationship the US and China has, which has been tumultuous, especially during this time. How does that US-China relationship then affect us here in South Africa?
Well, the number of implications, of course, is that the more we see challenges between the US and China from a trade wars point of view, it's got material implications on particularly global growth. And as soon as you're seeing pressure points from a global growth point of view, and then investors tend to shy away from emerging markets, and you start to see portfolio flows leaving our economy. And so that's one of the things. And also because China is a particular importer of a lot of our primary sector goods from a mining point of view, when you're expecting lower growth in China, or when you're expecting China to be on a defensive or on a back foot, that has implications on the potential exports to China that we can have. And over and above that, and as I said, is that this is a conversation of global sentiment. And as soon as we've got challenges with the trade wars that continue to put pressure on sentiment, it has implications on oil prices. It has implications on other, I think, ancillary economic variables that have direct implications on South Africa. We know, of course, that South Africa is an importer of oil, and so when oil prices peak, for example, that has a particular pressure point on local consumers, on local businesses, etc. And so there are many, I think, touch points that result in South Africa being materially impacted by the trade wars between the US and China. And so it becomes quite important to ensure that there is some confidence that's built back into the market, and therefore investors can also plan their investment activity on the back end of that.
Thank you so much for your time. Sifiso Skenjana, economist, there speaking to us about the impact of the outcome of the US elections on South Africa.